He believed the lie that she could never become a mother, so he erased her from his life without mercy. Years later, fate brings the Korean Mafia boss face to face with the woman he abandoned, standing stronger than ever, holding twin sons who carry his blood. In that moment, power means nothing, and regret takes everything. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, show your love like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support and love mean everything to us and give us strength to bring you the next emotional story. Let's start. Alexander Kang ruled Seoul's underworld without spectacle. He didn't need violence on display or loud threats whispered in dark alleys. His reputation alone bent men's spines. A single message from him could end bloodlines, and a single favour could build empires. Those who worked under him called him chairman. Those who opposed him called him death, usually just before disappearing. Emotion had never been part of Alexander's calculations. Power required clarity, not just sentiment. Love was a distraction for weaker men, and mercy a luxury he had buried long ago. That was why the coastal operation was meant to be routine, an anonymous trip to a forgotten village to silence a leak and return to the city unchanged. The village sat at the edge of the sea like an afterthought, battered by salt, wind, and poverty. Houses leaned into one another as if sharing exhaustion. Alexander arrived quietly with a handful of trusted men, dressed plainly, weapons hidden. He expected fear. He expected suspicion. He did not expect her. She stood at the shoreline, feet planted in wet sand, hauling a fishing net from a narrow boat alongside an elderly man whose breathing sounded too shallow for the work he was doing. The net was heavy, waterlogged, resisting every pull. Still, the woman didn't hesitate. Her movements were efficient, strong, practiced. When the man stumbled, she shifted instantly, bracing him with one arm while keeping the net from slipping back into the sea. Alexander stopped walking. She wore worn clothes, faded and patched, but she carried herself with quiet authority. Poverty surrounded her, but it did not define her. Her skin glowed deep and rich under the pale sky organ, her expression calm even as strain pulled at her muscles. She didn't complain. She didn't rush. She simply endured. "Boss, oh," one of the men said softly, unsure why Alexander had halted. Alexander didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the woman. He learned her name from a villager later that morning. Zaria Mensa, a black African woman who lived with her father on the margins of the village. Outsiders, the villagers said. Too proud, too quiet. Zaria worked harder than anyone, took the worst jobs and asked for nothing. That night, while his men handled business, Alexander found himself thinking about Zaria's hands, scarred but steady, gentle but unyielding. Strength like that wasn't taught, it was forged. By dawn, the leak was contained, the problem eliminated. Yet Alexander remained. He went to the shore alone. Zaria was there again, folding nets, her father resting nearby. She looked up as Alexander approached, her gaze steady, unafraid. That alone unsettled him. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly. Alexander studied her face, searching for hesitation. He found none. "Come with me," he said. "I'll give you a life beyond this place." Zaria's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what would I be to you?" Alexander answered without pause. "My wife." The word shocked even him. Silence stretched between them, broken only by waves. Zaria glanced at her father, at the sea that had taken more than it ever gave. Then she looked back at Alexander Kang, the man whose shadow ruled a city. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Alexander's voice was even. "Then you stay here. But I'll never forget you." Zaria studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. "I'll come," she said. "But I will not belong to you." Alexander closed his fingers around hers. At the time, neither of them understood how true her words would become. The mansion sat above the city like it had been carved out of arrogance. High walls, black gates, cameras that watched without blinking. Zarya stepped through the entrance beside Alexander Kang and felt the air change. The village wind still clung to her skin. But inside the estate, everything smelled like polished stone and expensive silence. Servants lowered their eyes. Men in suits paused mid-step. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Alexander moved as if the house were an extension of his body. He didn't introduce her with tenderness. He introduced her like a decree. "This is Zarya," he told them. "She will be my wife." No one argued out loud. No one would. But Zarya heard the shock in the pauses, saw it in the stiffening shoulders. When Alexander walked away to handle calls and meetings, the mansion's true voice surfaced. Quiet, sharp, and cruel. At dinner, his family sat like judges. His mother, Madame Kang, watched Zarya the way someone inspected a stain they didn't know how to remove. His aunts whispered behind fans. His cousins stared openly, not bothering to mask their disgust. Zarya kept her posture straight. She didn't shrink, didn't plead, didn't soften herself to make them comfortable. "Where did you find her?" an aunt asked, as if Zarya couldn't understand the language. "A beach," another answered with a thin laugh. "How fitting." Madame Kang didn't laugh. She set down her chopsticks with slow precision. "Alexander," she said, voice smooth as poison, "you're making a spectacle of this family." Alexander's gaze didn't shift from his plate. "I'm making a decision." "This isn't a decision," his mother replied. "It's an embarrassment." Zarya met Madame Kang's eyes. "I didn't ask to be here," she said evenly, "but I won't be insulted for existing." A few people inhaled sharply. In that room, speaking like that was a kind of rebellion. Alexander finally looked up. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of warning. "No one insults my wife." The word wife didn't warm the room, it froze it. The wedding happened quickly, almost brutally. No celebrations spilling into the streets, no laughter, just tradition, signatures, and the quiet arrangement of power. Zarya wore a white dress chosen by people who didn't know her, and Alexander stood beside her like a statue, hands steady, face unreadable. Cameras flashed. The family smiled for show. Behind their smiles, their hatred sharpened. In private, Zarya learned Alexander's rules. There were rooms she wasn't allowed to enter without him. Conversations that ended when she entered. Names spoken in hushed tones. She saw the outline of what he was without needing confirmation. Men who bowed too deeply. Security that moved like soldiers. Visitors who arrived pale and left trembling. One night, as Zarya stood on a balcony overlooking Seoul's lights, Alexander joined her. "You're quiet," he said. "So are you," she answered. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost nothing. "This life is hard." Zarya didn't look away from the city. "So was mine?" For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then he offered something she didn't expect. "Do you regret coming?" he asked. Zarya turned toward him, studying the man behind the legend. "I regret nothing," she said, "but don't mistake my strength for surrender." Alexander's eyes held hers. "Good," he said softly. "I didn't bring you here for surrender." It was the closest thing to peace they had. Two strong people standing side by side, not because the world was kind, but because neither of them knew how to bend. And, for a while, against all logic, the cold man found something near calm in Zarya's steady warmth. Not love, not yet, but something dangerously close. 2 years passed, and the mansion never truly accepted Zarya. It merely learned to tolerate her presence when Alexander was watching. The insults grew subtler. wrapped in etiquette and sweet smiles. But Zarya could taste the bitterness in every helpful suggestion and every carefully timed silence. What changed everything wasn't a fight or a scandal. It was emptiness. In Alexander's world, an heir wasn't just a child. An heir was proof of permanence, a symbol that the empire wouldn't fracture the moment its king fell. Men followed bloodlines as much as fear. Without a successor, rivals grew bold, allies grew cautious, whispers travelled through back rooms like rats. At first, Alexander didn't speak of it. He returned home late, shoulders heavier, jaw tighter, and said nothing while Zarya poured him tea she didn't drink herself. She would watch him stare past the cup, eyes narrowed as if he were trying to solve a problem he'd never allowed himself to feel. Then, his mother started circling. Madame Kang increased her visits as if she owned the walls. She brought doctors to dinner and spoke loudly about traditional duty, about the future, about a wife's purpose, never addressing Zarya directly unless it was to slice. "A woman can be beautiful," she said one afternoon, "and still be useless." Zarya kept folding laundry in her lap, hands steady. "Is that what you were taught?" she asked quietly. Madame Kang's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I was taught what keeps a family alive." The pressure tightened in layers. Alexander's lieutenants began asking careful questions. Business partners offered solutions. Even Evelyn Hahn's name, daughter of a billionaire tycoon, floated through conversations like perfume, hinting at alliances that could be sealed cleanly. Zarya tried to speak to Alexander. "We can go to a clinic," she suggested one night. "Together." Alexander's eyes flicked up from his phone. "We already did." She frowned. "We did?" He hesitated, only for a heartbeat. "The family doctor ran tests." Zarya's stomach turned. "Without me knowing?" "You were asleep," he said flatly. "It was," she'd handled. Handled. Like a shipment. Like an obstacle. Days later, Alexander came home with a folder. He didn't throw it at her, didn't shout. That would have been easier. Instead, he placed it on the table between them like a verdict. Zarya opened it slowly, reading the medical language that was meant to feel clinical and undeniable. Barren. Infertile. Unlikely to conceive. Her chest went cold. "This isn't true," she whispered. Alexander's face remained controlled, but something behind his eyes looked torn. Anger mixed with disappointment, confusion mixed with betrayal. "The doctor says it is." Zarya's hands trembled. "I've never even been examined by that doctor." Alexander's voice sharpened. "Are you calling my family liars?" "I'm calling the report a lie," she replied, forcing steadiness into her tone. "And if your mother is involved..." Enough. The word snapped like a whip. For the first time since she'd met him, Zarya saw Alexander's empire take priority over the person in front of him. His family had planted a seed, and the underworld had watered it with fear. No heir meant weakness. Weakness meant challengers. Challengers meant blood. And blood, to Alexander, was always unacceptable, unless he was the one spilling it. Days became unbearable. Madame Kang's remarks turned into open commands. "End this. Fix your mistake. Do what you must." Even the servants began acting as if Zarya were already gone, avoiding her gaze, removing her things in tiny, humiliating increments. Zarya refused to beg, refused to collapse. But she started to realize something terrifying. Alexander was changing. The man who once defended her with a single sentence now listened longer to his mother's poisonous calm. He came home colder, kissed her less, spoke to her like she was a problem to be solved. One evening, Alexander stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his shadow swallowing the light behind him. "Pack your things," he said. Zarya's breath caught. "Alexander, you're leaving tonight." Her voice broke only slightly. Because of a paper I never agreed to? His jaw clenched. Because I can't afford this anymore. Zarya stared at him, trying to find the man who watched her on the shore like she was a miracle. What she found was a king choosing his throne over his truth. "What do you want from me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Alexander's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed deadly calm. "Disappear." Alexander didn't let the departure become a scene. He didn't shout. He didn't drag Zarya by the arm. He did something worse. He treated her like a finished chapter. A driver took her out past the city lights and left her on a quiet street with nothing but the clothes she wore and a thin envelope that felt more like an insult than help. The car pulled away. The sound of its engine faded. Soul swallowed her whole. Zarya stood under a street lamp, numb at first, then burning. Not because she'd lost luxury, she had survived poverty before. Not because she'd been rejected, she had faced contempt her whole life. The pain came from the betrayal of believing, for a moment, that she had finally reached a place where she would not be discarded. She walked until her feet ached, mind racing, holding herself together by force. When nausea hit her, she blamed hunger. When it hit again, sharper, she stopped at a pharmacy and bought the cheapest test she could find. In a cramped restroom, she stared down at the result until the lines blurred. Pregnant. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her knees threatened to fold. But Zarya didn't collapse. She gripped the sink, breathing through the tremor, and a single thought cut through everything else. They lied. She didn't know how yet, but she knew it in her bones. The report, the timing, Madame Kang's certainty, the way Alexander didn't even question it. The betrayal wasn't only his, it was engineered. Zarya vanished, not dramatically, quietly. She found shelter where no one connected to the Kang name would look, a tiny apartment under a different name, a job no one would brag about, a phone that couldn't be traced. She didn't call Alexander. She didn't beg for justice from a man who had already chosen his throne. Instead, she built a new life with her rage as fuel. And while Zarya rebuilt herself, Alexander replaced her like a business contract. He married Evelyn Hahn, a billionaire's daughter with perfect manners and an even more perfect family name. The wedding was grand, polished and praised by the same people who had called Zarya a stain. Alliance sealed, respectability restored. Madame Kang smiled like she had won. But time has a cruel sense of balance. Years passed, no heir came. Evelyn's marriage to Alexander was cold and correct, a partnership of appearances. They attended events, posed for cameras, sat across from each other at dinners like strangers. Alexander's empire kept moving, but the emptiness didn't leave. It only grew louder. 5 years after Zarya disappeared, Alexander found himself walking through the VIP wing of Seoul's newest, most prestigious medical center with Evelyn at his side. They were there for consultations, quiet questions, another attempt to solve what pride refused to name. The staff snapped to attention before Alexander could speak. Not for him, for someone else. A woman approached, surrounded by elite security, dressed in understated elegance that screamed power without begging for recognition. Her stride was unhurried, her eyes sharp. Alexander's world tilted. It was Zarya. Not the Zarya he had thrown into the street. Not the Zarya in worn sleeves by the fishing nets. This Zarya carried herself like she owned the ground beneath her because she did. The hospital directors hovered behind her like anxious students. A plaque near the entrance bore her name as owner and CEO of a global pharmaceutical empire. Evelyn stiffened beside him. Alexander couldn't move. Then 2 boys, 5 years old, came running down the hall, laughing as they raced towards Zarya. They were identical in height and fire, with the same sharp eyes and stubborn jawline Alexander saw in mirrors. They crashed into Zarya's legs, and she knelt to catch them, kissing their heads with a tenderness that didn't reach her gaze when she looked back up. Alexander's mouth went dry. His pulse roared. Zarya rose slowly, her expression composed, almost amused. "Alexander," she said, as if greeting an old acquaintance. His voice barely worked. "Zarya?" She tilted her head. "You didn't even know," she said softly. "When you threw me away, I was already carrying them." Alexander's face drained. "The report was forged," Zarya cut in, calm as a knife. "Your mother bribed the doctors. I found the proof. Too late to save what you broke, early enough to save myself." The boys clung to her hands, peeking at Alexander with curious, defiant eyes. Zarya's smile turned colder. "I will never be discarded again." Alexander stood there, shattered, realizing he had traded his true family for a lie, and built his life on someone else's cruelty. And in the days that followed, he began dismantling his empire piece by piece, not out of nobility, but desperation, to keep the shadows from ever touching Zarya's world again. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He worked for a single hope, that one day his sons might learn his name not as a monster, but as a father.